The old man stood outside the house he had built with his own hands, holding a small suitcase in one hand and his wife's trembling fingers in the other. Rainwater ran down his gray hair and soaked the shoulders of his worn brown coat. Beside him, his wife was crying silently, trying to understand how the front door of her own home had been locked against her. Behind the curtains, their only son watched them from the warm living room. "Daniel," his mother called through the rain. "Please, open the door. We have nowhere to go." For a moment, the curtain moved. She saw his face, the same face she had kissed every night when he was a child, the same eyes she had stayed awake beside whenever he was sick, the same son for whom she had sacrificed nearly everything. But Daniel did not open the door. Instead, he turned off the porch light. That night, 70-year-old Robert and 68-year-old Margaret walked away from the house they had spent 40 years building, believing they had lost everything. They did not know that only 4 months later, their son would lie inside a crushed car, unable to feel his legs. And as the paramedics pulled him from the wreckage, Daniel would whisper only 2 words: "My parents." But by then, he did not know whether they were still alive, and he had no idea whether they would ever forgive him. 42 years earlier, Willow Street had looked very different. There had been no luxury apartments, no expensive coffee shops, and no rows of polished cars parked along the sidewalks. It was a quiet, working-class neighborhood where families knew one another. Children played outside until sunset, and people borrowed sugar without feeling embarrassed. Robert Miller was 28 when he first saw the empty piece of land at the end of the street. There was nothing beautiful about it. The grass had grown wild. Broken wooden boards were scattered across the ground, and an old, rusted fence leaned dangerously to one side. Most people passed the property without even noticing it. But Robert stopped. He stood there for nearly 20 minutes, imagining a small, white house with blue shutters. He saw flowers beside the porch, a vegetable garden behind the kitchen, and children running across the yard. At that time, Robert worked as a mechanic at a small repair shop. He earned enough to pay rent and buy groceries, but not much more. Margaret worked part-time at a local bakery, waking before sunrise to prepare bread and cakes.
They had been married for 3 years and were renting a tiny apartment above a noisy laundromat. Every night the machines below shook the floor. Still, Margaret never complained. "This is temporary," Robert often told her. She would smile and rest her head on his shoulder. "As long as we are together, I already have a home." Robert never forgot those words. He wanted to give her more than a rented apartment. He wanted to build something permanent, something that would remain long after they were gone. It took them almost 2 years to save enough money for the land. They stopped eating at restaurants. Margaret repaired her old dresses instead of buying new ones. Robert worked evenings and weekends, sometimes returning home with oil covering his hands and exhaustion in his eyes. When they finally signed the papers, Margaret cried. Not because the property was valuable. It was not. She cried because it belonged to them. The construction took almost 4 years. Robert did much of the work himself. Friends helped him raise the walls, install the windows, and repair the roof whenever his limited budget forced him to use second-hand materials. Margaret brought sandwiches and hot coffee to everyone. She planted roses before the house was even finished, saying the garden should grow alongside their family. Then, during the final year of construction, Margaret discovered she was pregnant. They had been trying to have a child for years. Several doctors had told them it might never happen. When their son was born, Robert held the tiny baby against his chest and wept harder than Margaret had ever seen him cry. They named him Daniel.
"He will never feel alone," Robert promised. "We will give him everything we never had." And they kept that promise. Perhaps too well. Daniel grew up as the center of their world. When he wanted a bicycle, Robert worked extra shifts to buy it. When he wanted new clothes because other children at school had expensive brands, Margaret quietly used the money she had saved for a winter coat. When Daniel failed an exam, his parents never punished him. "He is still young," Margaret would say. When he spoke disrespectfully, Robert would become angry, but Margaret always defended their son. "He has a good heart. He will understand when he grows older." Daniel learned an important lesson from their endless forgiveness. Not the lesson his parents intended. He learned that no matter what he did, they would always forgive him. As a little boy, Daniel was affectionate and curious. He followed Robert around the garage, asking questions about every tool. He helped Margaret bake bread and stole pieces of warm dough when he thought she was not looking. But as he entered his teenage years, something changed. Daniel became embarrassed by his parents. Robert's hands were rough and permanently stained from years of repairing engines. Margaret wore simple clothes and drove an old car that made a loud noise whenever she turned the key. Daniel began asking them not to attend school events. "Everyone else's parents dress better," he once told his mother. Margaret smiled, as though the words had not hurt her. "I understand. You are becoming independent." That night, however, Robert found her crying in the kitchen. "He is just a child," she whispered. Robert looked toward Daniel's bedroom. He is old enough to know when he is hurting someone. But Robert did not confront him. Neither of them did. They were too afraid of pushing their only son away. When Daniel graduated from high school, he announced that he wanted to attend a private university in another city. The tuition cost more than Robert and Margaret had saved in 10 years. "We cannot afford the full amount," Robert explained carefully. "But there is a good state college nearby. You could live at home and—" "I knew you would say that," Daniel interrupted. He stood up from the dinner table, anger burning in his face. "You both told me I could become anything. Now you want me to stay here and live an ordinary life like you." Margaret looked shocked. "Daniel, your father is only trying to—" "I am not going to spend my life fixing other people's cars." The room became silent. Robert stared at his son. For the first time, he saw not a confused teenager, but a young man who was ashamed of him. Daniel left the house that night and did not return until the following afternoon. Margaret had been awake the entire time. By the end of the week, Robert made a decision. He withdrew most of their retirement savings and used the money to pay Daniel's first year of tuition. When Margaret discovered what he had done, she became frightened. "That money was for our future." Robert looked at a photograph of Daniel on the wall. "He is our future." So Daniel left for university. At first, he called every evening. Margaret waited beside the telephone, listening happily as he described his classes, his professors, and the people he had met. But the calls slowly became less frequent. Every evening became every week. Every week became once a month. Sometimes months passed without a single call. Whenever Robert complained, Margaret defended their son. "He is busy." Too busy to ask whether his mother is alive? "He is building his life, Robert. With our money." "Do not say that." Robert would sigh and change the subject. They continued paying Daniel's expenses. When he said he needed a new laptop, they bought one. When he wanted to move into a better apartment, they paid the deposit. When he said he needed money for professional clothes, Margaret sold a necklace her mother had given her. Daniel never asked where the money came from. He simply accepted it. After graduation, he found a job at a real estate company. He was intelligent, ambitious, and extremely persuasive. Within a few years, he became one of the company's best salesmen. Daniel knew how to make people trust him. He learned how to study their fears, discover their desires, and tell them exactly what they wanted to hear. Clients admired his confidence. His managers praised his ability. His income grew, and so did his pride. He bought an expensive car, rented a modern apartment, and surrounded himself with people who cared about status as much as he did. Yet he rarely visited Willow Street. Whenever Margaret called, Daniel had an excuse. He was working, he was traveling, he had an important meeting. He was too tired. Years passed. Robert retired from the repair shop after developing severe pain in his back and knees. Margaret stopped working at the bakery when her hands became too weak to knead dough.
Their income became smaller, but their life remained peaceful. The mortgage had been paid. The house belonged to them completely. They grew vegetables, watched old movies, and sat together on the porch every evening. Margaret still kept Daniel's childhood bedroom exactly as he had left it. His school trophies stood on the shelf. A faded blue jacket hung inside the closet. Photographs of him covered the walls. "Why do you keep this room unchanged?" Robert asked one afternoon. Margaret ran her hand across the old desk. "Because one day he may come home." Robert did not answer. He no longer shared her certainty. Then, one Sunday morning, a black car stopped in front of the house. Margaret was watering the roses when she heard the car door close. She looked toward the street and froze. Daniel was walking up the path. He wore a dark suit and carried an expensive leather briefcase. His hair was perfectly styled, and a shining watch covered his wrist. For several seconds, Margaret could not move. Then she dropped the watering can and hurried toward him. "Daniel!" She threw her arms around her son. Daniel stiffened slightly before returning the embrace. "Hello, Mom." Robert appeared in the doorway. Unlike Margaret, he did not smile immediately. "It has been almost a year," he said. Daniel lowered his eyes. "I know. I am sorry." Margaret touched his face. "You are here now. That is all that matters." She led him inside and began preparing his favorite meal. For the first time in years, the house felt alive. Daniel asked about Robert's health. He listened as Margaret talked about the garden. He laughed at old family memories and apologized for staying away. "I have been selfish," he admitted. "I became so focused on work that I forgot what was truly important." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "We never stopped waiting for you." Robert remained cautious. Something about Daniel's sudden warmth felt unnatural. But when his son turned toward him and said, "Dad, I want to make things right," even Robert felt a small part of his anger begin to disappear. Over the following weeks, Daniel visited regularly. He brought groceries, repaired broken appliances, and drove his parents to medical appointments. He even began calling Margaret every evening. She was happier than she had been in years. "I told you he had a good heart," she said to Robert. Robert watched Daniel through the kitchen window as he spoke on his phone in the yard. "People do not change that quickly. He is our son. That does not mean we should stop thinking." Margaret frowned. "You have wanted him to return for years. Now that he has returned, you are suspicious." Robert looked at her tired face and said nothing more. One evening, Daniel arrived, carrying several folders. He placed them on the dining table and spoke in a concerned voice. "I have been thinking about both of you." Margaret smiled. "We think about you too." "No, Mom. I mean your future, your health, this house.
Robert's expression changed. What about the house? Daniel opened one of the folders. The neighborhood is becoming more expensive. Property taxes will probably increase. There are also legal risks if either of you becomes seriously ill. Margaret looked confused. What legal risks? Daniel leaned closer. If something happened to Dad, the transfer process could become complicated. There could be court fees, taxes, and delays. You might even have trouble accessing the property. Robert crossed his arms. We have a will. Wills can be challenged. Trust me, Dad, I work in real estate. Daniel removed several documents. The safest solution is to temporarily transfer the house into my name. I can manage the taxes and legal responsibilities. You will continue living here exactly as before. Nothing will change. Robert looked at the papers, but did not touch them. Why would the house need to be in your name? To protect it. From whom? From the government, from legal complications, from anyone who might take advantage of you. Robert's eyes narrowed. And you believe transferring our only property to you would protect us? Daniel sighed as though he had expected resistance. I knew you would misunderstand. Margaret placed her hand on Robert's arm. Let him explain. Daniel turned toward his mother. I am trying to help. You and Dad spent your whole lives working for this house. I do not want you to lose it because of some technical legal problem. Would we still own it? Margaret asked. In practice, yes. Legally, I would hold the title, but it would always be your home. Robert pushed the folder back across the table. No. Margaret looked at him. Robert, I said no. Daniel's jaw tightened. Dad, you do not understand how these things work. I understand enough to know that a man should not sign away his home.
Daniel became silent. Then his expression softened. All right. I will not pressure you. He collected the papers and smiled at Margaret. I only wanted to protect you. But as he placed the documents back into his briefcase, Robert noticed something that made his stomach tighten. Daniel had already marked the pages where their signatures were required. He had not come to discuss the transfer. He had come expecting them to agree. What Robert did not know was that Daniel's concern had nothing to do with taxes, inheritance, or protecting his parents. Daniel was in serious financial trouble. He had made several risky investments with money that did not belong to him. He owed more than he could repay, and his company had begun investigating missing funds. He needed a large loan immediately, and the house on Willow Street was worth nearly 7 times more than Robert had originally paid for it. To Daniel, it was no longer the home where his mother had raised him. It was the solution to all his problems, and he had already decided that one way or another, the house would become his. For the next several days, Daniel did not mention the house again. He continued visiting his parents as though the conversation had never happened. He brought Margaret fresh fruit, fixed the loose handle on the kitchen door, and drove Robert to a doctor's appointment. He was patient, attentive, almost gentle. That frightened Robert more than anger would have. Daniel had never been a patient man. Whenever he wanted something as a child, he had demanded it immediately. If he did not receive it, he complained, argued, or disappeared until Margaret gave in. Now he behaved like someone waiting for the right moment. Robert watched him carefully. One afternoon, while Daniel was outside taking a phone call, Robert opened the leather briefcase his son had left beside the sofa. He knew it was wrong. He had never searched Daniel's belongings before, not even when Daniel was a rebellious teenager. But the feeling in his chest would not leave him. Inside the briefcase were property records, bank statements, and several letters stamped with the words "Final Notice." Robert picked up one of the letters.
Daniel owed more than $200,000 to a private lender. Another document showed that his apartment had been used as collateral for a previous loan. A third revealed that his company had suspended him pending an internal financial investigation.
Robert's hands began to shake. At the bottom of the briefcase, he found an unsigned loan application. The listed collateral was the house on Willow Street. Their house. Robert heard the back door open. He quickly returned the papers and closed the briefcase. Daniel entered the room, still holding his phone. For one brief moment, father and son looked at each other. Daniel's eyes moved toward the briefcase, then back to Robert. "Is everything all right?" he asked. Robert forced himself to remain calm. Why wouldn't it be? Daniel studied his father's face. No reason. That evening, after Daniel left, Robert told Margaret what he had found. She sat silently at the dining table, her hands folded in her lap. "He is in trouble," she finally said. Robert stared at her. "That is what you heard?" "He must be desperate. He planned to use our house to pay his debts. Maybe he was going to explain. He lied to us. He may have been ashamed. Margaret, he brought documents for us to sign without telling us the truth." She looked down. "He is our son." Robert struck the table with his palm. The sound made her jump. "And we are his parents. Does that mean nothing?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears. Robert immediately regretted shouting. He sat beside her and lowered his voice. "I am not angry with you. I am afraid." "Of Daniel?" "Yes." She shook her head. "I cannot be afraid of my own child." "You should be afraid of what desperation can make people do." For several minutes, neither of them spoke. Then Margaret whispered, "We cannot abandon him." Robert looked at her. "I am not asking you to abandon him. I am asking you not to give him our home." "What if he goes to prison?" "Then he must face what he has done." Margaret covered her mouth. Robert softened. "He is not a little boy anymore. We cannot keep saving him from every consequence." She began to cry quietly. Robert took her hand. "He needs help. But giving him the house will not save him. It will only teach him that he can use us again." Margaret nodded, but Robert could see she was not convinced. The following morning, Daniel called while Robert was in the garage. Margaret answered. "Mom," Daniel said, his voice low and tired, "can I talk to you privately?" Margaret glanced toward the back window. Robert was sorting old tools on a workbench. "What happened?" "I made mistakes." She closed her eyes. "What kind of mistakes?" "I trusted the wrong people. I invested money for clients, and the deal collapsed. Now everyone thinks I stole from them." "Did you?" There was a long pause. "I was going to replace the money before anyone noticed." Margaret gripped the phone tightly. "Oh, Daniel. I never wanted to hurt anyone. But you took money that was not yours. I borrowed it. Without permission." Another silence. Then Daniel began to cry. Margaret had not heard her son cry since he was a child. "Mom, I am going to lose everything." She sank into a kitchen chair. "Come home. We will talk. I cannot face Dad. He knows." Daniel's breathing changed. "You told him?" "He found the letters." Daniel swore under his breath. Margaret frowned. "Do not speak like that." "I'm sorry. I did not want him to know. He thinks you only came back because you wanted the house. That is not true, isn't it? Daniel did not answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was weak. At first, yes. Margaret felt something break inside her. But then I remembered what it felt like to be here. I remembered you, Dad, my room. I know that sounds impossible, but I started to feel like your son again. You have always been our son. Then help me. Margaret closed her eyes. Your father will never agree. He does not understand what will happen if I cannot pay. What will happen? They will charge me. I may go to prison. People may come after me, I do not know. Margaret's face turned pale. Who would come after you? The lender is not a bank. She looked toward the garage again. Robert had his back turned. What are you asking me to do? Daniel lowered his voice. I am not asking you to give me the house forever. Just help me transfer it temporarily. I will use it to secure a loan, pay everything back, and return the title within a year. Daniel, you would not have to move. Nothing would change. Your father said no. Dad has always believed the worst about me. That is not true. He never loved me the way you did. Margaret's voice sharpened. Do not say that. Your father gave you everything. He gave me money. You gave me love. Margaret became silent. Daniel knew exactly where to press. He had spent years selling properties to people who were afraid, uncertain, or emotionally vulnerable. He understood that facts rarely controlled decisions. Feelings did. And no feeling was stronger than a mother's fear of losing her child. Mom, he whispered, I am not asking because I am greedy. I am asking because I am terrified. She wiped tears from her cheek. What do you need? Daniel exhaled slowly.
I only need your signature on a few documents. What about your father's? Because both your names are on the property, we will eventually need both. But there is one document you can sign first. It allows me to begin the legal preparation. Margaret hesitated. Bring it tomorrow. Do not tell Dad yet. Her expression changed. I will not lie to my husband. You are not lying. You are giving me time to find a solution. Daniel, please, Mom. One day, that is all I am asking. Margaret looked through the window at Robert. He was now sitting on a small wooden stool, rubbing his injured knee. He looked older than he had a year earlier. She knew what he would say. She also knew Daniel might be arrested. I will look at the document, she said. I am not promising to sign. Thank you, Mom. After the call ended, Margaret remained in the chair for several minutes. She told herself she had not agreed to anything. She would only read the paper. She would ask questions. She would protect both her son and her husband. But deep inside, she already knew that when Daniel placed the pen in her hand, refusing him would be almost impossible. The next afternoon, Daniel arrived while Robert was visiting an old friend. He looked exhausted. His suit was wrinkled, and dark circles surrounded his eyes. He carried no briefcase this time, only a thin folder. Margaret prepared coffee, but Daniel did not drink it. He placed the document on the table. This is only a limited power of attorney, he explained. Margaret stared at the page. The language was dense and difficult. Long paragraphs contained words she did not fully understand. What does it allow you to do? Speak to the bank and the property office on your behalf, nothing more. Can you sell the house? No. Can you take out a loan? Not without Dad's approval. That was not completely true.
The document gave Daniel authority to represent Margaret in property matters, including signing certain forms connected to refinancing and ownership transfer. But Daniel knew she would not understand the legal language. "Should I ask a lawyer to read it?" Margaret asked.
Daniel looked wounded. "You do not trust me?" "This is important. I know. That is why I prepared it carefully. I'm not accusing you. It feels like you are." Margaret reached for his hand. "Daniel, you admitted that you came back because you needed the house. And I also admitted that I was wrong." He pulled his hand away. "You told me I had always been your son. But the moment I need you, you treat me like a criminal. You committed a crime." The words escaped before Margaret could stop them. Daniel's face hardened. She immediately regretted it. "I did not mean, no, you are right." He stood and picked up the folder. "I should not have come." "Daniel, sit down. I deserve whatever happens." He turned toward the door. Margaret saw not a dishonest businessman, but the small boy who had once fallen from his bicycle and run into her arms with blood on his knees. "Wait!" Daniel stopped. She held out her hand. "Give me the document." He slowly returned to the table. Margaret read the first page again, though the words blurred through her tears. "Promise me this will not hurt your father." "I promise." "Promise me we will not lose the house." "You have my word." "Promise me you will fix everything." Daniel placed the pen beside her hand. "I promise." Margaret signed. Her signature was small and slightly uneven. Daniel watched the pen move across the paper. When she finished, he kissed her forehead. "You saved my life." Margaret held his face between her hands. "Do not make me regret this." "I never will." But before he reached his car, Daniel had already called an attorney. "I have the mother's authorization," he said. "Prepare the remaining transfer documents." "What about the father?" the attorney asked. "I will handle him." That evening, Margaret told Robert that Daniel had visited. She did not mention the document. It was the first serious secret she had ever kept from her husband. The guilt stayed with her through dinner. It followed her into bed. At midnight, she was still awake. Robert turned toward her. "Is something wrong?" "No. You've been quiet all evening." "I'm only tired." Robert reached for her hand beneath the blanket. After 42 years of marriage, he knew when she was hiding pain. But he trusted her too much to imagine she was hiding the truth. 3 days later, Daniel returned with another set of papers. This time, he waited until Robert was home. He placed the documents on the dining table. "I spoke to a financial advisor," he said. "There may be a way to protect the house and help me without transferring ownership permanently." Robert did not sit down. "I already told you no." "Please listen first. I have seen your debts." Daniel's face changed. "You searched my briefcase. I found a loan application using our home as collateral. I was desperate. You were planning to steal our house. I was trying to survive." Robert leaned forward. "By sacrificing us?" Daniel looked at Margaret. She lowered her eyes. "Mom understands." Robert turned toward his wife. "What does that mean?" Margaret's lips parted, but no words came. Daniel answered for her. "She signed a limited authorization so I could explore our options." Robert stared at Margaret. For several seconds, he did not move. "You signed something?" Tears filled her eyes. "Robert, I only wanted to help him." "What did you sign?" "Nothing dangerous," Daniel said quickly. I was not speaking to you. Margaret stood. He said it would only allow him to speak to the bank. Robert looked at Daniel. Give me the document. I do not have it with me. Then this conversation is over. Daniel opened the new folder. These papers cancel the previous authorization and replace it with a family trust. Robert did not know that the documents had been designed to look far less dangerous than they were. Some pages described estate planning and medical authority. Others referred to tax protection and inheritance. Hidden among them was the deed transferring ownership of the property to a company Daniel had created 2 weeks earlier. The pages requiring Robert's signature were marked with small yellow stickers. Robert picked up the first document. I will take these to a lawyer. Daniel's heart began to race. There is a deadline. Then we will miss it. If we wait, the lender may file charges. That is your problem. Margaret gasped. Robert! He turned toward her. What do you want me to do? Give him the house because he stole money? He could go to prison. He knew that before he took it. Daniel stood abruptly. You have always wanted me to fail. Robert looked at him with disbelief. I emptied my retirement account for your education, and reminded me of it every chance you got. I never reminded you because you never asked what it cost us. Daniel's voice rose. You think being poor made you noble? It did not. It made you bitter. Robert's face went pale. Margaret stepped between them. Stop, both of you. Daniel pointed toward the papers. This is not only about me. If I go to prison, the investigation will become public. Reporters may come here. Neighbors will know. Everyone will know what your son did. Robert gave a humorless laugh. You think embarrassment frightens me more than homelessness? You will not be homeless. That is what every thief says before taking the keys. Daniel's expression hardened. The warmth disappeared from his face. For one moment, Margaret saw something cold and unfamiliar in her son's eyes. Then he gathered the papers. All right. He walked toward the door. Margaret followed him. Daniel, where are you going? To surrender. Her face drained of color. What? I cannot pay. I cannot fix it. Dad has made his decision. Robert said nothing. Daniel opened the door. I hope you both enjoy the house. Margaret grabbed his arm. Please do not do anything foolish. What choice do I have? She looked toward Robert. Sign the papers. Robert stared at her. No. Please. You do not understand what you are asking. I am asking you to save our son. I am trying to save us. Margaret began to sob. Daniel stood silently beside the door, watching them. Robert had seen his wife cry many times during their marriage, when her parents died, when Daniel left for college, when doctors warned them she might never have children. But this was different. She looked completely broken. He is all we have, she whispered. Robert's anger weakened. No, he said. We have each other. He is our only child, and we are the two people he is willing to destroy. Margaret covered her face. Daniel lowered his head, pretending to cry. Robert looked from his wife to his son. He knew the documents were dangerous. He knew Daniel was lying. Yet he also knew that if he refused, Margaret might spend the rest of her life believing he had allowed their son to go to prison. Robert had protected her from many things: poverty, illness, loneliness. But he could not protect her from loving Daniel. Give me the papers, he said. Daniel looked up.
Margaret stopped crying. Robert returned to the table and sat down. "I will sign only the documents related to the trust. Nothing that allows you to sell or mortgage the property." "Of course," Daniel said quickly. "You will return tomorrow with copies." "Yes. And if I discover that you lied to us?" Robert looked directly into his son's eyes. "You will no longer have a father."
"Of course," Daniel said quickly. "You will return tomorrow with copies." "Yes. And if I discover that you lied to us?" Robert looked directly into his son's eyes. "You will no longer have a father." Daniel placed the papers before him. Robert read each title carefully. The legal language exhausted him. The documents were more than 30 pages long, and Daniel explained every paragraph in a calm, professional voice. When Robert reached the deed, Daniel covered part of the title with another page. "This one confirms the property will be placed inside the family trust," he said. Robert adjusted his glasses. "Why does it list a company?" "The company manages the trust. It is only a legal structure." "Who owns the company?" "The family." It was another lie. Daniel was the sole owner. Robert looked at Margaret. She stood beside him with red, swollen eyes. Then he signed. One page, then another, and another. With each signature, Daniel came closer to owning everything his parents had spent their lives building. When Robert finished, Daniel placed the documents into the folder. "I will fix this," he said. "I promise." Robert did not respond. Daniel left the house before sunset. The following morning he filed the deed. By the end of the week, the house on Willow Street legally belonged to Daniel's company. He immediately used it as collateral for a large private loan. Part of the money paid his urgent debts. Another part disappeared into a new investment Daniel believed would restore his fortune. For several weeks, nothing changed. Robert and Margaret continued living in their home. Daniel called less often, but Margaret convinced herself he was busy repairing the damage. Then a letter arrived. Robert found it in the mailbox. It was addressed to Daniel's company, but the property address was theirs. The letter stated that the loan payment was overdue. Robert read it twice. Then he drove directly to the county property office. Margaret waited at home. He returned 3 hours later. His face was gray. "What happened?" she asked. Robert entered without removing his coat. He placed a copy of the property record on the table. Margaret looked at the page. She saw Daniel's name, then the company name, then the words, "legal owner." "I do not understand," she whispered. "He took the house." "No." "He owns it." "No, it is inside the trust." "There is no family trust." Margaret shook her head. "He promised." Robert looked at his wife. "He lied." She called Daniel immediately. He did not answer. She called again and again. By evening, she had left 7 messages. Daniel finally arrived the next morning. He did not look ashamed. He looked irritated. Robert was waiting for him in the living room. "You transferred the house into your company," Robert said. Daniel removed his coat. "I had to." "You said it was a family trust. The lender would not accept the trust structure." "You forged the explanation." "I did what was necessary." Margaret stood near the stairs. "Daniel, return the house." "I cannot." Her voice trembled. "What do you mean?" "It is collateral now." Robert stepped forward. "You will cancel the loan. The money is gone." The room became silent. Margaret gripped the railing. "Gone where?" "I paid some debts. I invested the rest." "You gambled with our home," Robert said. "It was not gambling." "Did the investment succeed?"
Daniel did not answer. Robert grabbed him by the front of his shirt. "You stole 40 years of our lives." Daniel pushed his father's hands away. "Do not touch me." Margaret began crying. "Please, Daniel. Please fix this." "I am trying." "How much time do we have?" Robert asked. Daniel looked toward the window. "Maybe 3 months before the lender takes action." Margaret covered her mouth. Robert's voice became low. "You will sell your car, your apartment, everything you own." "I already lost the apartment." "Then get another job." "My company fired me." Robert stared at him. "So you have nothing?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "I have this house." Robert stepped back as though he had been struck. Daniel immediately realized what he had said. "Dad, I did not mean—" "You have this house," Robert repeated. "It is the only asset left." Margaret approached her son. "You will not remove us from our home." "Of course not." But Daniel could no longer repay the lender. 2 months later, the lender threatened foreclosure. Daniel found another solution. A property developer offered to buy the house for enough money to clear the loan and leave Daniel with a substantial profit. There was only one condition: the house had to be empty. Daniel avoided telling his parents for as long as possible. Then, one cold November morning, he arrived with an official notice. Robert read the first line and understood everything. "You sold it." Daniel stood near the door. "I had no choice." Margaret looked between them. "What does it say?" Robert handed her the paper. Her eyes moved slowly across the page. "Notice to vacate. 30 days." She sank into a chair. "This is our home." Daniel's voice was quiet. "I found a small apartment for you." Robert tore the notice in half. "You will tell the buyer the sale is canceled." "I cannot." "You can and you will." "The contract is signed." "Then break it." "I would owe damages." Robert laughed bitterly. "You are worried about damages?" "Dad, shouting will not change anything." Robert moved toward him, but Margaret stepped between them. "Where is this apartment?" she asked. Daniel looked relieved that she had spoken. "It is outside the city. The rent is reasonable." "Who will pay it?" "I can cover the first 3 months." "And after that?" Daniel said nothing. Margaret stared at him. For the first time, she seemed to see him clearly, not as the baby she had prayed for, not as the boy she had defended, not as the frightened son asking for help, but as a man who had decided his parents' safety was worth less than his own comfort. "You planned this," she whispered. "No. You knew we could lose the house. I thought the investment would work. But when it failed, you chose yourself." Daniel looked away. Margaret removed the key to the house from her pocket. She placed it on the table between them. "When you were 6 years old, you were afraid of the dark. Every night you came into our room and slept between us." Daniel remained silent. "When you were 12, you broke your arm. Your father stayed beside your hospital bed for 2 days without sleeping." "Mom, when you left for college, I sold my mother's necklace so you could buy a computer." "I know." "No, you do not." She stepped closer. "You remember receiving things. You do not remember what they cost us." Daniel's eyes became wet. Whether from guilt or frustration, Margaret could not tell. "I am sorry." Robert looked at him coldly. "Sorry does not return a house." Daniel left before lunch. During the following weeks, Margaret packed 42 years of memories into cardboard boxes. She wrapped the family photographs in old towels. Robert carried furniture into the garage and tried to decide what they could afford to keep.
They could not take everything. The apartment Daniel had found was small, located above a closed convenience store in a neighborhood far from their doctors, friends, and church. The bedroom was barely large enough for one bed. There was no garden, no porch, no place for Robert's tools. On the final morning, Margaret walked from room to room, touching the walls. In the kitchen, faint pencil marks remained beside the doorframe where they had measured Daniel's height as he grew. Age 6, age 9, age 13. Margaret placed her fingers over the highest mark and began to cry. Robert stood behind her. "We do not have to leave quietly," he said. "We can challenge this in court." "With what money?" "I will find a lawyer." "And if we lose?" "At least we fight." Margaret shook her head. "I'm tired." The new owner's representative arrived at noon. Daniel came with him. Robert carried the final suitcase outside. A light rain had begun. Margaret remained on the porch. She looked at Daniel. "May I keep the rose bushes?" Daniel appeared confused. "What?" "I planted them before you were born." The representative glanced at his watch. "The property must be surrendered as it stands." Daniel could have objected. He could have asked the buyer to allow his mother to dig up one small plant. Instead, he said nothing. Margaret nodded slowly. He could have asked the buyer to allow his mother to dig up one small plant. Instead, he said nothing. Margaret nodded slowly. Then she stepped off the porch. Robert and Margaret walked toward the street with 2 suitcases and a box of photographs. Behind them, Daniel entered the house to complete the final inspection. Margaret turned back. "Daniel," he looked at her from the doorway. "Please do not make us leave tonight. The apartment is not ready." Daniel's face tightened. "The buyer takes possession today. We can sleep here one more night." "I cannot allow that." Robert stared at his son. "You cannot allow your parents to sleep in the house they built?" Daniel did not respond. The rain became heavier. Margaret began to shiver. "Open the door," she whispered. "Please." For a moment, Daniel looked as though he might change his mind. Then the representative said, "We need to finish." Daniel stepped inside and closed the door. A few seconds later, the porch light went dark. Robert took his wife's hand. They walked away in the rain. From behind the curtain, Daniel watched them reach the end of Willow Street. He told himself they would be fine. He told himself the apartment was temporary. He told himself that once his finances recovered, he would buy them a better home. But the truth was simpler. Daniel had chosen money over the 2 people who had loved him most. And as his parents disappeared into the rain, he had no idea that fate had already begun preparing the price he would pay. Daniel watched his parents disappear into the rain. For a few seconds, he almost ran after them, but the sound of his phone interrupted him. It was Victor. "Congratulations," Victor laughed. "The house is officially sold. The money has arrived." Daniel looked at the empty street. His parents were gone. He slowly closed the front door. "This is business," he whispered to himself. "They'll understand one day." It was the biggest lie he had ever told himself. Within a week, Daniel had paid off part of his debts. With the remaining money, Victor convinced him to invest in what he called a guaranteed opportunity. "This will double your money in a few months," Victor promised. Daniel believed him. He transferred almost everything he had left. For a while, everything seemed perfect. Victor sent reports showing impressive profits. Daniel rented a luxury apartment and convinced himself that the difficult days were over. Meanwhile, Robert and Margaret were living a completely different life. The apartment Daniel had promised did not exist. After spending one cold night at a bus station, Robert swallowed his pride and called his old friend Thomas. Thomas immediately came with his wife, Susan. "You're staying with us," Thomas said firmly. "No arguments." A few days later, they helped Robert and Margaret rent a tiny one-bedroom apartment. Robert found work repairing cars at a local garage. Margaret volunteered at a nearby church kitchen in exchange for small meals and groceries. Neither of them complained. They simply tried to begin again. Daniel never called. Each time he picked up his phone, guilt stopped him. He always told himself the same thing. Tomorrow. Tomorrow became another week, then another month. One evening, Daniel received an unexpected message.
"We need to talk, immediately." It was from Victor. When Daniel arrived, Victor looked nervous. "There have been problems." "What problems?" "The investment failed." Daniel laughed. "Stop joking." "I wish I were." Daniel's smile disappeared. "How much did we lose?" Victor lowered his eyes. "Almost everything." Daniel felt the room spinning. "No, that's impossible. It wasn't our fault. The market collapsed." Daniel grabbed him by the collar. "You promised it was safe." Victor pushed him away. "You made the decision." Daniel rushed to the bank the next morning. His accounts were almost empty. The money from his parents' house was gone. Everything collapsed quickly. His expensive apartment was taken back. His luxury car was repossessed. Clients began demanding answers about missing funds. Police investigators contacted him. His lawyer looked at him across the desk. "Daniel, if they prove you used client money to cover investment losses, you're facing serious criminal charges." For the first time in years, Daniel was afraid. Real fear. At the same time, Margaret became seriously ill. Long days of stress, cold weather, and exhaustion developed into pneumonia. Robert stayed beside her hospital bed every evening after finishing work at the garage. One night, Margaret quietly asked, "Have you spoken to Daniel?" Robert looked away. "No." "Call him. He knows where we are. Please." Robert finally dialed the number. Daniel stared at his ringing phone. He knew exactly who was calling. He watched it ring until the screen went dark. He could not bear to hear his father's voice. Later that night, he listened to the voicemail. "Your mother is in the hospital," Robert said quietly. "If you still remember that you have parents, come." Daniel sat alone in silence. Then he deleted the message. Days passed. Margaret slowly recovered. Every morning she looked toward the hospital door. Daniel never came. She never complained. She simply stopped asking. Daniel's own life continued falling apart. Investigators froze his remaining accounts. Victor disappeared without leaving a trace. Friends stopped answering his calls. The people who had once praised his success suddenly acted as though they had never known him. For the first time, Daniel understood what loneliness felt like. He had money once. Now he had nothing. One rainy evening, Daniel packed a small suitcase. His lawyer had warned him that an arrest could happen within days. He decided to leave the city before that happened. As he drove through the highway, his phone vibrated. It was a message from Margaret. Only one sentence. "No matter what happened, you are still our son. Please come home." Daniel stared at the screen. His vision blurred. He reached toward the phone. At that exact moment, a truck ahead lost control on the wet road.
Daniel looked up. There was no time to brake. The impact shook the highway. Metal twisted, glass exploded. Darkness swallowed everything. Daniel opened his eyes 2 days later. Bright hospital lights filled the room. He tried to move. His arms responded. His legs did not. A doctor stepped beside the bed. "Mr. Miller, you've suffered a severe spinal cord injury." Daniel looked down. He tried again. Nothing. The doctor spoke gently. "We don't yet know whether you'll ever walk again." For several seconds, Daniel heard nothing else. His expensive suits, his luxury apartment, his career, his money, even his freedom had already disappeared. Now, perhaps, his legs were gone too. For the first time since throwing his parents out of their home, Daniel broke down completely. Not because he had lost his wealth, but because he suddenly realized there was only one place he truly wanted to go: home. And he no longer knew if home would still open its door for him. 2 days after Daniel's accident, the hospital finally found Robert and Margaret. A social worker had searched old records until she located their small rented apartment. When Margaret answered the phone and heard the words, "Your son has been in a serious accident," her hands began to shake. "Is he alive?" she whispered. "Yes." "Can I see him?" "He has asked for both of you." Margaret thanked the caller and immediately called Robert at the garage. "It's Daniel." Robert stopped working. "What happened?" "He was in a terrible accident." Robert remained silent. "The doctors think he may never walk again." For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Finally, Robert said quietly, "I'll come home." Margaret was already wearing her coat when Robert arrived. "We have to go," she said. Robert did not move. "He wasn't there when you were in the hospital." Margaret lowered her eyes. "I know. He watched us lose everything." "I know. He left us in the rain." "I remember." Robert looked at her. "Then why?" Margaret answered with tears in her eyes. "Because he is still our son." Robert closed his eyes. After a long silence, he picked up his jacket. "I'm not going because he deserves it." "Then why?" "Because I won't let you face this alone." Daniel had spent 2 days staring at the ceiling. Doctors came and went. Nurses helped him move. Every time he looked at his motionless legs, fear tightened around his heart. For the first time in his life, he needed help to do the simplest things. He wondered whether his parents even knew where he was. Then the hospital room door slowly opened. Margaret stepped inside. Daniel looked at her and immediately burst into tears. "Mom!" Margaret hurried to his bedside and embraced him. For several moments, neither of them could speak. "I'm sorry," Daniel whispered over and over. Margaret simply held him. Then Daniel noticed Robert standing near the door. His father did not smile. He did not come closer. "Dad?" Robert nodded once. "I'm here." Daniel lowered his eyes. "I didn't think you'd come." "I came because of your mother." The doctor explained Daniel's condition. His spine had been badly damaged. Rehabilitation would take months. No one could promise that he would ever walk again. When the doctor left, silence filled the room. Daniel finally looked at his parents. "I took your house." Neither of them answered. "I lied to both of you." Margaret quietly nodded. "Yes." "I ignored your calls." "Yes." I deserve this. Robert spoke for the first time. No. Daniel looked at him in surprise. You deserve to answer for your choices, Robert continued. But no father wishes to see his son lying in a hospital bed. Daniel covered his face. I destroyed everything. Robert slowly stepped closer. You destroyed trust. Daniel nodded through tears. I know. You cannot undo that. I know. But what happens next is still your choice. Those words stayed with Daniel long after Robert stopped speaking. The following days were painful. Daniel began rehabilitation. Simple movements became exhausting. He could no longer sit up without assistance. He struggled just to transfer into a wheelchair. One afternoon, after failing again, he struck the wheel with his fist. I can't do this. The therapist calmly replied, You've spent your life believing someone else would solve your problems. Daniel looked at her. This one, only you can solve. For the first time, Daniel stopped arguing. He tried again. Margaret visited almost every day. Robert came only once a week. He never brought flowers. He never spoke about forgiveness. Instead, he repaired Daniel's loose wheelchair brake, adjusted the footrests, and quietly asked the doctors about his recovery. Daniel finally understood something. His father still cared. But caring was no longer the same as trusting. Several weeks later, detectives arrived at the hospital. Daniel's lawyer advised him to stay silent. Instead, Daniel surprised everyone. Yes, he said, I transferred my client's money. Yes, I lied. Yes, I stole from my parents. The room fell silent. His lawyer stared at him. Daniel, stop talking. Daniel slowly shook his head. No more lies. He gave investigators every detail he knew about Victor and the missing money. When the interview ended, the detective quietly said, Your honesty won't erase your crimes. Daniel nodded. I know. But it may help recover what belongs to your victims. For the first time in months, Daniel felt that he had made one honest decision. That evening, Robert came to visit. Daniel expected another lecture. Instead, his father quietly pulled a chair beside the bed. I heard you confessed. Yes. Why? Daniel looked out the window. Because I finally understood something. Robert waited. I kept thinking I ruined my life because of one accident. He shook his head. But I ruined it long before that. Robert looked at his son for a long moment. Then he stood up. As he reached the door, he turned back. This is the first decision you've made in a long time. That gives me hope. It was not forgiveness. It was something much smaller. But for Daniel, it meant everything. Daniel's confession helped investigators find several hidden accounts connected to Victor Lane. It did not recover all the stolen money, but it recovered enough to return part of the victim's savings. For the first time since his arrest, Daniel felt he had done something for someone other than himself. A few days later, Margaret asked Daniel, There's someone who wants to meet you. Who? One of your victims. Daniel lowered his eyes. I don't think I deserve that. That isn't your decision. The meeting took place in a quiet room at the rehabilitation center. An elderly woman slowly entered with her daughter. Her name was Helen Brooks. Daniel immediately recognized her. She had trusted him with her retirement savings. He could barely lift his eyes. I am so sorry, he whispered. Helen remained silent for several moments. My husband worked 40 years to save that money, she finally said. Daniel felt his throat tighten. I know. No. She gently shook her head. You know the amount. I know what it meant. Daniel could not answer. Helen continued. When I lost those savings, I stopped trusting everyone. Those words hurt more than any prison sentence. Daniel quietly replied, I cannot undo what I did. No. I can only spend the rest of my life trying to make it right. Helen studied him for a long moment. Then she stood. I don't forgive you. Daniel nodded. I understand. As she reached the door, she stopped. But I hope you become a man who never hurts another family again. Then she left. Daniel remained alone. For the first time, he understood that forgiveness could never be demanded. It had to be earned, and sometimes it never came. Several weeks later, Daniel appeared before the court. The prosecutor described everything he had done: the fraud, the stolen client funds, the deception, the theft of his parents' home. Then she also acknowledged his complete cooperation with investigators. After a long pause, the judge spoke. Mr. Miller, your crimes caused enormous harm. Daniel lowered his head. But your cooperation has allowed authorities to recover part of the victim's losses. The judge announced the sentence. Daniel would serve several years in a secure medical correctional facility because of both his crimes and his physical condition. After his release, every legal payment he earned would continue going toward restitution until his debts were repaid. Daniel simply replied, I understand. He asked for no mercy. Life inside the Correctional Rehabilitation Center was difficult. Daniel had no expensive clothes, no business, no luxury apartment. Every morning he attended physical therapy. Every afternoon he worked in the prison library, helping organize books and teaching basic computer skills to other inmates. The small amount of money he earned was automatically sent to his victims. The payments were tiny, but every month they arrived without fail. Daniel never attached excuses, only one sentence. This will never repay what I took, but I will continue.
Outside the prison walls, Robert slowly recovered from his heart attack. He could no longer work full-time. Margaret continued volunteering at the church. Together, they rented a modest ground-floor apartment with a small balcony. One spring afternoon, Margaret planted a single rose bush. Robert smiled. It reminds me of Willow Street. Margaret gently touched the first flower. The old garden is gone. Yes, but life still gives us a chance to grow something new.
4 years later, Daniel was released. His wheelchair rolled slowly through the prison gate. Robert and Margaret were waiting. Daniel stopped in front of them. For several seconds, no one spoke. Then Robert stepped forward. He placed one hand on Daniel's shoulder. Let's go home. Daniel broke into tears, not because he was finally free, but because, after everything he had done, his parents were still standing there. Daniel never became rich again. Instead, he accepted a position with a non-profit organization that educated elderly people about financial fraud. Every presentation ended with the same words. One dishonest decision can destroy many innocent lives. Don't wait until you lose everything to understand the value of honesty. Years passed. Slowly, very slowly, trust returned. Not completely. Some wounds never disappear. But Robert no longer looked at his son with anger. Margaret no longer cried every time it rained. One quiet evening,
Daniel watered the rosebush on their balcony. Robert watched him for a moment. Then he quietly asked, "Do you remember the house?" Daniel smiled sadly. "Every day." Robert nodded. "So do I." After a long silence, Daniel gathered the courage to ask, "Dad, have you forgiven me?" Robert looked at the blooming roses, then at his son. "I will never forget what happened." Daniel lowered his head. But forgiveness isn't forgetting. He rested his hand on Daniel's shoulder. It's choosing not to let yesterday destroy what is left of today. Daniel closed his eyes. For years, he had dreamed of buying back the old house. Now he understood something far more valuable. A house could be lost. Money could disappear. Health could change in a single moment. But a family willing to rebuild together was a blessing money could never buy. And that became the greatest gift of Daniel Miller's second life. Before you go, I want to thank you for spending your time with this story. Like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring you more emotional, inspiring, and true-to-life stories.